I come from Northwest University. It's a big university, about 150 kilometers south of Johannesburg. And we have about 60,000 students on 3 campuses. So, I first want to acknowledge SSTAP office in Pretoria in South Africa, which are sitting at the Department of Science and Technology, for the financial assistance to make it possible to come here. And then Ben's for inviting me. You know, it's the first time I've been to 35 and worked in 35 countries. I've never been to London. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a problem with the word restoration, although I also use it, because I don't know if you are doing a lot of reclamation, rather, especially in arid lands, where we try to stabilize the soils. Or are we really only doing rehabilitation, where trying to rehabilitate the ecosystem services, the functioning and the processes? Or are we really doing restoration, where we are trying to get to the pre-existing and historical biotic integrity of the system? The problem is that we often do not know what the reference site or the condition is. So if you look at the Society of Ecological Restoration diagram over time, the original system, which is very complex, has degraded to a very or less complex system. And over time we are trying to restore it to this desired state. But we have to bear in mind in time, where are we on this gradient before we can really talk about restoration ecology. So we're not going to talk about rehabilitation of mines that we do a lot in southern Africa. This, for example, is the platinum mine tailings, the biggest mine tailings in the world. It can be seen from outer space. If you drive around it, you drive 58 kilometers. So we do a lot of rehabilitation of mines. We're not going to talk about that. I like the definition for the Society of Ecological Restoration, where they talked in 2001 about the recovery and management of the biodiversity, ecological processes and structures. But then they came up in 2002 with another definition, and my friend James Harrison told me that scientists, they argued 5 years about this one sentence, about the definition. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged and destroyed. And just to get to to be on the same page, I believe in this definition of the ecological restoration. Now, we do rangeland restoration or rehabilitation. Now, what are rangelands in Southern Africa? Where the climatic conditions are very low, are very dry, and no crop production can be done. It's mainly used for livestock husbandry. South Africa, 80% is agricultural land, of which 86% is used for livestock production, and it is estimated that 66% is moderately to severely degraded. And you can understand why there's a high pressure on the natural resources in Southern Africa. Furthermore, in our country, rangeland degradation has multiple causes. Site is community specific. It is a complex interplay between social and technical factors. Financial concerns and social priorities are often ruled above ecological principles. It's a shame for that. And then restoration operates over longer time scales. What are the causes? Mainly contributing to soil, erosion, salinization, loss in biodiversity, but I want to talk about the long-term loss in natural vegetation that we are trying to do in South Africa. Trying to restore the vegetation cover, look at the increase in the woody and the bush encroachment, as we call the woody shrub encroachment, we call it bush encroachment in our country, the encroachment of alien vegetation, this change in species composition and deforestation and the draining of wetlands. It also causes an increase in poverty, as we've heard from Elena and then also others. And people don't practice sustainable land management practices over the long term because they are more interested into industrial development, which causes pollution, urbanization, and we have a big problem with insecure land tenure. You must just realize that 92% of soil degradation are linked to agricultural practices. In West Africa, mostly, and also in southern Africa, we have a lot of deforestation. And coming across this gentleman, taking the wood to the market in Niamey in West Africa, the fine to the policeman were 3 bundles of wood. So you can imagine how the forest has been degrading. And we also have a problem with population growth like everywhere in the world. But it's important to notice here that the population growth is, over the last decade or two, is mostly in developing countries. We have a problem with industrialization, especially an impact on biodiversity and food production, which includes a huge amount of pollution in our country. And we also have a problem of urbanization, which encroaches into the grazing lands. As you can see here, the informal settlements occurring in valuable grazing lands or natural rangelands. So in 2008 already, we passed the threshold of the increase in urbanization and the rural development. So urban, 2008, the threshold was crossed. On the global scale, in 2008, we estimated 50-50 urban-rural, but it's estimated that in 2050, we will have 70% people living in urban areas and only 30% in rural areas. In South Africa, we have 4 of the 9 provinces already past the 50% threshold, and nearly 60% if you look at South Africa here on the side. We can see 4 provinces have already passed that of the 9 provinces. So people are living in urban areas. Another main problem is this woody or bush encroachment that we call it. It occurs in the Kalahari desert savanna. I'm calling it, Kalahari is not a desert, it's a savanna. And then also in the tree grass savannas. If you look at this example here, for example, between Namibia and Botswana, you can see this is the border here. This is a picture just of the corner here. You can see the red is more shrub or bush or woody encroachment. Whereas on the other side of the border in Botswana here, there's the border between Namibia and Botswana, you can see no trees. So what is causing this? Here you can see it more clearly. In Namibia, using remote sensing, you can see that this is a huge shrub bush encroachment, and in Botswana not. Is it fire? Is it human population? Is it overgrazing? We don't know. I think it's fire. But a lot of people also say that overgrazing causes land degradation and desertification in the long term. And we can spot it by these making use of remote sensing by looking at the biospheres in the paddocks of in the grazing lands, where you can see the degraded areas, and then we study these gradients away from these biospheres on a gradient to understand how the species on the degradation gradient change. Some species will decrease, while other species will increase, and especially bare ground will increase on a degradation gradient. So there's this change in species composition due to grazing on the degradation gradient. We can also study trajectories. For example, these 5 sites over a 4-year period, where certain sites improve, certain sites more or less stay the same on a degradation gradient, while others pass the threshold. So we first have to see where we are on the gradient before we can apply restoration. Land tenure is a big problem in southern Africa. As you can see here, this is a commercial land, mainly owned by one person. And this is the communal land, where many people have to make a living from the land, small croplands, a lot of population growth, and so, I mean, there's no difference. But there's still a lot of erosion coming from the commercial land. So land tenure, do we have one farmland, or do we have a lot of people living in the same area? We are also experiencing some climate change. And it's interesting, when I got this on the internet, you can see that it's very hot on the western side, on your side, and areas with more rainfall on the eastern side. If you look at the 9 provinces of South Africa, you will see this on the western side and this on the eastern side in South Africa. This is the Fynbos, there's Cape Town. You can see this is the Fynbos biome, and then the two Karoo biomes, the grassland, and then the savanna biome, the main biomes. The savanna biome being the biggest biome. And because we have less rainfall, more on the western side, and it increases to the eastern side, the production is also less on the western side as it increases to the eastern side. So rainfall is a very important aspect, and it has been estimated that in the year 2015, I think it's much too early, that the climatologists estimate that the Karoo biomes will shift, the grassland biome will shift, and the savanna biomes will shift, because we will have this extreme temperature and hot climates and less rainfall on the western side. Meaning that we will have wide areas representing climatic conditions not encountered in South Africa, and we will have a loss in biodiversity. So what are we doing about it? So a lot of people must realize that there is a difference between aridity and drought. And farmers often don't understand that concept, because they're similar in appearance, and they mustn't be confused, because aridity is over the long term, permanent deficient in rainfall, whereas drought is over the short term with unpredictable rainfall that we have in South Africa. It also causes loss in vegetation cover. It also has a socio-economic impact, causing hunger and poverty and increased migration. But if we take the classification of aridity, which is the ratio between the mean annual precipitation and the evapotranspiration, and we look at UNESCO's classification of hyper-arid, arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas, we must realize that that South Africa has 8% of hyper-arid areas, 47% of arid areas, and 39% of semi-arid areas. So 94% of South Africa is semi-arid, meaning we will get less than 650 to 700 millimeters per annum in a normal rainfall year. That is why it's important, if you want to study restoration ecology or the recovery, that we take these long-term cycles of rainfall into consideration. And not only if we have in dry years, we do have some peaks in dry years. We have some peaks of above average rainfall. And then we say, in these drought years, we have higher rainfall areas. As we can see here, a very high peak in the 1990 in a dry cycle. And that is what people think, now we are doomed because we are having a drought. But we are actually staying in a very arid area. So we are using some technologies to restore rangelands. And I'm not going to talk about engineering structures where we are trying to control erosion, which there are many. I've worked in many parts of South Africa, but I'm concentrating, as you can see, here's our Northwest University in the Northwest Province, and this is the Northern Cape Province. I'm trying to concentrate my research now in the Mulupua areas, which is the more semi-arid areas, and the hyper-arid areas in the Kalahari, with border to Namibia and Botswana. So this area is that I'm concentrating on my research. You must realize that we have a huge diversity in animals. So we have to restore the land according to the animals that are kept on the land. The approach that we use, we try to work together with the extension officers, being environmentalists, agriculturalists, government departments, because a lot of them are not existing anymore, so the research is needed. So the problem is identified by the land users and the managers. They come to the researchers, and we try to help the extension with certain applications. Awareness, training, expert advice, monitoring, capacity building programs. So the research has a very important role to play in the whole management of our rangelands. But before we do that, if people ask me, what do we want to restore or rehabilitate or reclaim our land? I say, for what? We have to define the objectives. You want to use it for agriculture, produce food for humans, for grazing, for livestock and game? Or do you want to restore the biodiversity? What do you want to do with it? If you're in the Kruger National Park in South Africa, you want high biodiversity. But if you are in other areas, you want to have more food production. Is it to control erosion, increase the vegetation composition, improve the pastures, to increase the biomass? What do you want to do? Or do you just want to relieve poverty and give people money for the economic development? What is your aim of the restoration that you want to do? So we classify our areas into passive and active interventions. Now, what are passive restorations? We look at the fence line effects like this one. It's mostly due to grazing, not rainfall, because this fence line and not soil, because these fence lines are not on soil differences or on climatic differences. They are the same. It's due to grazing. So passive restoration is done, but the resilience of the ecosystem is still high with limited structural and functional damage. The control, you can control or reduce the livestock. You can introduce better management strategies, and the system can still recover itself more or less with very low input costs. But if you return to active restoration, the resilience is very low with high stress factors. The ecosystem has lost its structure and function. It passed a threshold that I've just shown you on the gradient. The community is an alternative state, and now I have to do additional management interventions with revegetation or control of woody species with very costly inputs. As I said, I work mostly in the Kalahari savanna, and it's often called the Kalahari desert, which is not right. And you can see it consists out of parallel dunes and interdune streets. Here you can see from Google Earth map, it has these nice parallel dunes and interdune streets. And they degrade differently. So firstly, in the interdune streets, we get this, if it's a lot of overgrazing, we get this encroachment of the woody shrub, Rhagosum trachatoma, which is a woody shrub encroachment. And here you can see where a farmer has used chemical control to eradicate the woody shrubs here. And there's a lot of grass there now. And just adjacent where the farmer didn't do it, you still have this encroachment. So he tries to get more biomass for his livestock. That is the aim of his restoration. Here you can see another example. This is, just for interest's sake, the border between South Africa and Namibia. Not that Namibia is overgrazing, but here you can see a nice fence line effect of, in the interdune street, you'll see this bush encroachment here where the shrubs have been controlled. In the dune areas, you can see that a lot of the dunes are bare due to grazing. Because if you just put a fence up, and after 5 years it will look like this, but if you overgraze over the long term, it will look like this. So we are trying to stabilize dunes. We do use different formations to stabilize the dunes, and we started that in 1997. And you can see after 10 years, very little has happened. It's not only overgrazing, it's not only rainfall, but in the dune systems, it's wind. Wind is the limiting factor. So you can see over 10 years, not very much vegetation has established. Only a few perennial grasses have established after what we call brush packing, where we use the twigs that we control the woody in the dune streets. We pack them on the dunes so that the seeds get trapped and that we can get perennial vegetation. And some areas have shown better, depending on how the wind blows. You can see the wind it's more in a depression on top of the dune, where there's less wind. So the height of the dune and the wind is a limiting factor. Of course, we have to do a lot of monitoring, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to restore degraded rangelands, we have to do a lot of monitoring. And here, you can see the change in the grazing capacity, where the woody species have been controlled. After 1 year, the grazing capacity was 257 hectares per large stock unit. After 2 years, the increase of the vegetation, 108 hectares. After 5 years, 32 hectares. You can see how the vegetation has increased, the biomass has increased, and you can keep more animals there. But then after between 5 and 10 years, the farmers, now I have a lot of vegetation. Now I'm going to graze the land. And of course, you jump back to a degraded area again. So it's all about management, correct management. In the woody savannas where the rainfall is higher, in the semi-arid areas, we have this encroachment of the bush as you see in the savanna areas, and it's controlled chemically by aeroplanes or by hand. And we often use this woody substance for organic material and to brush, pack degraded areas. Here you can see a nice image from a remote sensing where this farmer, having all these paddocks here, has done some control of bush woody. And this farmer not. The red indicating bush encroachment. So we can detect what are the processes taking place between woody encroachment and whether plants have been, whether woody species have been controlled. So a lot of people ask me, they want to revegetate. So we've done a lot of revegetation, or you can also call it reseeding or oversowing. But we only do it where there's a loss in the seed bed. And we must realize that there is a ratio, it's important to indicate what type of seeds, what type of vegetation will I use according to the size of the disturbance and the degree of the disturbance. There's a difference. And then, depending on the degree or the size of the disturbance, I use different species. So we also look at the distribution patterns. Certain species like Centrociliaris, blue buffalo, foxtail buffalo grass is widely spread, and we can use that easily. Or where other species are only confined to certain areas. We do a lot of laboratory tests of species that we can use before we can advise the person to do reseeding. We look at the seed types. To reseed or to revegetate, it's important to look at the seed type. Has it got a very smooth tester seed coat, or is the seed fluffy? It has different, it requires different revegetation mechanisms. Then we go to the glass house. We do experiments in the glass house before we go to the natural field experiments. And this is done in the Karoo. You can see this is the control area, and this is the reseeded area where we use different species to revegetate. For this purpose, agricultural production for higher biomass. Not biodiversity, but higher biomass for grazing areas. We work a lot with seed companies, and it's important to know when do they collect seed. For example, the seeds and how do they store the seed. For example, here you can see two types of batches. The one was sampled in 1994, one batch, the other one 1999. After 6 days, both of them emerged. But the seed that was older only had an emergency of about 25%, whereas the seed that was much fresher had an emergence of 40%, which is very high in arid areas. But ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest. In revegetation, it's about the crust formation. And I came upon this saying, despite his artistic pretensions, his sophistication and many accomplishments, man owes his existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And that's very important in dry lands. So we must look at the soil type, have a good knowledge of what type of soil we are dealing with. Is it crust formation? And be honest, we are trying to use water harvesting techniques. Like in West Africa, they make half moons to collect water where the vegetation grows. And I know, but farmers are getting desperate. You know, farmers are using big mechanical implements, plows, to disturb and cultivate the soil. And just to get more vegetation into it. But if you don't, in this area, for example, in the Karoo, farmers, and I don't say it's correct, they are really plowing very deep to mix the soil types. But if they plow very shallow, it will just silt up again after a year or two. And then if they plow deep, they will get much more vegetation cover. Here you can see another area where it's been denuded, and after about 4 or 5 years, you get this recovery of the vegetation. So farmers use tractors to restore the vegetation. or reclaim it in this time, in this example. They use different spacings, and they even use different seed types, and they use brush packing formations. As you can see, this area is the control area, and different experiments. So we have been researching over the years what type of technology works best in what area, and what are the seed types. We also, we've invented this organic block that we put seed and mulch and water and into a small block, and then we spread it all over the world, all over the degraded areas, not the world. Unfortunately not. And we can see that these degraded area patches have been restored. We also take seed and we put it in a supplement feed block, for example, of cattle or for game. And here you can see, especially for game areas, the buffalo, the seed put in the supplement feed block is then spread by the dung of the animal. Here you can see we've done it with sable, for example, or with buffaloes. And here in the sandy area it works quite well. You can see a dung patch, and you can see some vegetation establishing here. If you take the dung patch away, you will see some perennial species establishing. But it only works very nicely in sandy soils, where there is no crust. We have a few collaboration projects with different universities, for example in Germany. We are now trying to get the Spaces program funded by the German government in the year of science between Germany and South Africa. The title of the project is an integrated decision support system for sustainable rangeland management in southern African savannas, where we use modeling of vegetation dynamics because we must first understand the problem. So understand land degradation, the causes and the impacts, before we can apply restoration. And here we are trying to do that in the Mulapur area, in the Mulapur Nature Reserve. It's about 300 millimeters per annum, this area here, rainfall. The study site, you can see there is the Botswana area. You can just go back. There's Botswana, there's Namibia, and there's South Africa. South Africa has an area of about 1.2 million square kilometers, the area of South Africa. And Namibia, 845,000 square kilometers. And this is Botswana, a very large country. You can see we're on the border here. So that's Botswana, South Africa, and there's the Mulapur Nature Reserve. Yeah. So we are trying to understand what causes land degradation. And here you can see Botswana again, a lot of bare soil here. There's the river, the Mulapur River, causing the border between South Africa and Mulapur Reserve. And let's look at 1984 Landsat picture and concentrate on this area in the Mulapur Nature Reserve. You see it's very dark. 1994. 2005, very light. Degraded. But what are the causes? Is it grazing? Is it climate? Is it fire? Let's look at the vegetation. 1984, a lot of vegetation. 2005, very degraded with a lot of bare ground, a lot of peak areas. What are the causes? We cannot do restoration if we don't know what the causes are. So we try to understand the process of land degradation before we do restoration. We develop models like the space-to-temporal dynamics of vegetation. We see what do animal grasses do, what do small woody species do. And like Jim Reynolds already said, was it 10 years? Jim Reynolds said, there's and everybody said there's there's a complex interplay between socio-economic conditions and biophysical. So degraded areas have where this is very high and this is very high. The conditions is very poor in both areas. So we have to take both into consideration. So we try to participate with local land users. And you know what we do? We try to document indigenous knowledge. We're not documenting indigenous knowledge, we are trying to do that. We're just talking about it. Yes, we must get indigenous knowledge, but are we documenting it? So we involve farmers in land management, in restoration, in monitoring. Very important, involve the gender, the women. You know, we call that in South Africa pillow talk. In the evenings, when the husbands lie next to the woman, it's pillow talk, you know. You must do that. Because in South Africa, the black man, he has got to say. But in the evenings, we call it pillow talk. The woman talks to the husband. And the next day, the husband says what the woman said. So we must involve the gender and the youth, because that's our heritage. And then the farmers' days. And farmers' days, we have these outreach programs between farmers. Tell them what works and what doesn't work. In a recent project called Practice, which is the EU-funded project, where we studied the prevention, restoration, action, combat, desertification, integrated approach, 12 countries were involved, and you can see a lot of them in and around Europe, also in China, South Africa, Chile, Mexico, etc. We asked farmers to identify the indicators for assessing land degradation and how would they restore their area. So the farmers were actively involved. And we asked them what are the main indicators for land degradation. They said water supply. And then I said it, in an arid, dryland area, water supply. Then grazing capacity. Then the condition of the animals. The meat production must be higher for a higher income. The biomass production. We have to look after the soil. We have to look after the vegetation. But it costs us a lot of money. So the fencing, the biodiversity, it's not so high on the agenda because they're more into livestock production. How much money do they get from land care projects, for example, from government? And then also personal well-being. Is the family happy? Is the family happy? And when we tried to rank the indicators by the farmers, the first ranking was water availability. Farmers said water is our most important aspect, most important for in drylands. Secondly, personal well-being. We want that our family is happy. We want to send our children to school. We want them to have clothes, etc. The third one was amount of plants or grasses and more or less the same animal conditions. These are the four most important impact or indicators ranked by farmers. We tried to match that with biophysical quantitative assessment, and we looked at good management. We saw that the kilograms per hectare was nearly 4,000, 3,800 kilograms per hectare in good management areas, compared to poor managed areas, which is half, less than half. And where the bush control, you know, the shrub that I told you, was controlled, we have a higher biomass production, and in the dune stabilization also. So what are the actions that farmers said they want to do? First, they said, good management is the best. It overrules bush control, dune stabilization, and poor management. Bush control overrules poor management and dune stabilization, because dune stabilization is very costly. It was the last type of methodology restoration that they use. We've also developed a decision support system, which I call Eco Restore, which is on a CD available, DVD, where the land user can ask the computer. We have a lot of case studies which we entered into the computer. The landowner describes his problem, and the computer gives him some questions. Questions: what's the rainfall? What area are you? Where are you farming? What is your aim of the restoration? And then the computer tries to match it, the cases of the data that you have, and then the land user can get some answers. And that is of indigenous knowledge, trying to reinvent the wheel. Because we have a lot of people out there, did a lot of work over a lot of years, costing a lot of money. But are we capturing it? Are we putting it into databases? So we split our Eco-Restore database into the grass expert system and the bush expert system. Bush expert system meaning bush thickening and encroachment. And we developed that for Namibia, and the grass expert system where we are trying to restore or denude the grassland areas. But ladies and gentlemen, just be honest. Like Sue Milt and Richard Dean said, ranger degradation costs money. As we degrade the area, the costs will increase. It must be emphasized that restoration rehabilitation is not an instant solution to a major problem. I want to invite costs, countries, and scientists in Europe to come to South Africa, and are we prepared to setting up the Drylands and Desertification Restoration Hub both in Southern Africa, especially with working groups 4 and 5. I think this is our area that we are, and you can see the MOU for details, page 20 and 21. What working group 4 and 5, if you don't know what it means. So we can all, no one can go back and make a brand new start. Anyone can start from now and make a brand new ending. Remember that. And after the day of work, you must sit around the fire with a beer and think, what have you accomplished that year or today? Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, for posing those good questions. I have some good news for you. The statue outside is covered up not because it's cold.
Oh, okay. Let me put on my jacket.
I'll explain. I'll explain why. It's just British modern art.
Oh, it's modern art. And it doesn't belong to this university.
Don't blame
500 years old.
So we'll have a few minutes for questions. I'm sure there's questions to be posed by you. Yes, young lady. Please stand up, identify yourself.
I would just like to know that in your experimental crops, did you use any irrigation at all? Or was
No. Never use irrigation. Always we have a lack of water. We use species that are adapted to that certain areas. It must be indigenous species that are adapted to certain areas. That's why the Millennium Seed Bank says bank in which from Q. We have someone in South Africa that tells us which species are adapted. Very important to us.
I would like to know which chemical measures you needed. You said there was some to kill the bush or something like this.
Yes, there are many chemicals on the market. They have different names, but as you know how people advertise, they all have a very important ingredient that controls woody species. It's called tebuthyrin. Tebuthyrin. We have to control chrysobelis, for example. Bad cheese from Southern Africa. we control it with because it sucks up all our water. But in any case, on pizza South American, I know they have used a lot of chrysobelis. But tebuthyrin, you can call the chemical molopur, savanna, kalahari, whatever. But the active ingredient is tebuthyrin.
Okay, what is the half-life time then, and what is the behavior of this?
The trees will die in about, if you throw just granules, 5 granules per big tree, after 2 years, you will be dead.
But the substance.
Photosynthesis.
Yes.
Yeah, it retards photosynthesis.
I think the question was, what is the half-life and how long will it remain in the environment, this chemical?
The consultants will tell you no. After 5 days it's gone. The researchers will tell you 2 to 8 years. So who do you believe?
That's a really interesting talk. Thanks very much. You mentioned the use of seeds, different seeds. I know some of us are going to the Millennium Seed Bank.
Yeah.
And Eleanor also mentioned the use of seeds.
Yeah.
Now there's a lot of discussion about whether we use local seeds, local indigenous species from your part of South Africa.
Yeah.
And I know in Australia we've screwed around, we've imported lots of your weedy plants, and now they're all over the place, creating havoc in our
Sector
drylands.
ciliaris, for example.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a scourge of the drylands.
Yes.
So, could you give us some perspective on how we might select the correct plants, and whether or not we should be looking for that golden panacea, that plant from another country that's going to solve all our problems?
You know, it's pretty interesting. We concentrate on ecotypes. Try to concentrate on ecotypes. Because, like, you have certain ecotypes that are really adapted to certain areas. The problem is, the seed companies don't want to make money. The seed company wants to make money. So they don't want to sell seed if they cannot sell 50 tons of seed per annum. So getting local ecotypes is very difficult. And I've seen in experiments that we've done is that using local ecotypes, the emergence and there's there's a difference between germination, which is under the soil, which you don't see, emergence is coming up, and then establishment. There are three factors. So establishment, if you get an establishment of 2%, 2.5%, that's 2.5 seeds out of 100 seeds. It's very good. But with local ecotypes, it's less than that. So people revert to like the Tenure that we import from South America, from Argentina, or import of seed that we get from Australia. So that's why they use more seed that seed companies sell. And then a lot of farmers are disappointed that in the experiments, in the first 2-3 years, we get this high establishment rate. But after 5 or 6 years, or maybe 10 years, it will just drop down again. Because they are not adapted to the area. I haven't answered your question, but I don't know, it will give you some perspective. You know, I know countries, and as I say, I've been to many countries that have now disallowed, especially countries in the Middle East, have disallowed any buying of seed from other countries. Like South Africa, made a lot of money from selling seed. They're not allowed to sell it anymore because of the rules and regulations, and then also the seed coming in and making havoc in Australia. Thanks.
Some more questions? Is there a question? Audience?
I just would like to know, you spoke about the theory fire. You said, people say that it's grazing, overgrazing,
Yeah.
when you show the fences.
Yeah.
You said, I think it's fire, and I would like to know more about it.
Yeah, there is a threshold. When you have a lot, it's about fuel load. If you have a lot of grass, enough grass, you will get a very hot fire. But if you pass a threshold where the trees are too many, even if you have fire, you will not kill the trees because there's not enough fuel load. And in Botswana, there's a lot of fuel load all the time. And little grazing because it's an arid area. In Namibia, you have a lot of people with a lot of grazing. So they pass the threshold. You must look at the fuel load. And we say it's about 4 tons per hectare of biomass production. So you must first do an experiment and see if you more or less have 4 tons of biomass, above ground biomass of grass fuel load, before you can really use fire to control woody species. And in many areas, that's gone. You already passed the threshold. Marvin Freeland from Australia did a lot of research on that, of passing the threshold. You use biomass production and fire.